Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this afternoon panel session today. I hope you've all had a very good lunch. My name is Maura Fogarty, and I'm from BBC News. Our topic this afternoon is a new world disorder, understanding Asia's evolving geopolitical situation. Now, when I was first told the topic for this panel discussion, I was actually quite pleased because all I had to do was think back the last 3 or 4 months and how busy we've been in the news sector covering all the events that directly affect or are a result of the evolving political and geopolitical disorder here in Asia. If you think back to March, for example, when we had the first summit between North and South Korea under the current president, Moon Jae-in, they are going to have their 3rd meeting next week. If you think to June, for example, where for the very first time, the Singapore summit saw a North Korean leader meeting with a sitting United States president. Highly extraordinary and symbolic in a lot of ways as well, though I think some of our panelists may have some interesting comments on that. We've also seen, for example, a sign of potentially warming of relations between Japan and China, with President Xi meeting with Prime Minister Abe just a few days ago, and discussions of a potential summit in Tokyo in a few weeks' time. We saw pancake diplomacy, where 2 countries, Russia and China, for years mutually suspicious of each other, where we saw President Xi Jinping and President Putin flipping pancakes, blinis, and exchanging vodka toasts and wearing, that was a sight to see, actually, wearing aprons and obviously very uncomfortable trying to flip their pancakes there. We've also seen the launch of a trade war between 2 of the world's largest economies and Pacific powers in themselves. So a lot of events just in the last 4 or 5 months alone that really highlight to us that this is a changing world that we're living in, and how do we make sense of that, and how do we as businesses operate in this environment. Well, joining me today are 3 very distinguished panelists. To my right is Mr. Yasuhide Nakayama. He is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the lower house of Japan. He's also a member of the House of Representatives. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Next to him is Robert Kelly. He's a professor of international relations at Pusan University. I would just add also a BBC regular as well. And to his right is Mr. Kwon Ping, the executive chairman of Banyan Tree Holdings. So gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. Now, I'm going to do something a bit unusual, and instead of asking the panelists a question, I'm going to ask all of you a question first. I'd like to see a show of hands, if I could. Could you think back and give me an indication? Do you think that here in Asia today, we are in a safer, more stable, and more secure world than we were 10 years ago? So if you agree that we are in a safer, more stable world in Asia today than 10 years ago, please raise your hands. So about a quarter? I think a quarter of the panel, a quarter of the audience? So a quarter of you think that we're in a safer, more stable world than 10 years ago. Let me pose that question now to our panelists. And I'll start first with Mr. Ho at the end. What do you think?
Well, I think if you define or you equate safety with certainty, I would say we're probably in a much less safe world today. There's a lot more uncertainty because right now, as the topic seems to be indicating, although it's a bit of a cliche about a world in transition, I think it's probably within the last 2 years or so that we're seeing an epochal change in civilizational relationships, even beyond the more immediate issues of the trade war or US-North Korean relationships. I think there are 2 things that are happening that make me believe we're in a very grave period. One of them is, I think, the fact that democratic liberalism and liberal democracies around the world are facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions. And the scarier thing is that it's not just the rise of the far right in European countries, it's the fact that liberal democracies themselves have no idea at all of how to even deal with the far right's rise to power. That's even more frightening than anything else. And at the same time, while you see democratic liberalism sort of collapsing of its own weight in Europe and in America, you're seeing the rise of China in a civilizational way, not just in terms of China's military power, etc. I think you're beginning to see, probably over the next decade, the decline of a Pax Americana, as it were, the whole post-World War II order that was defined by American sort of dominance over the world, and you're beginning to see the rise of a Pax Sinica. Now, it's not as if the two are going to be similar to each other, but clearly civilizational relationships are changing. And I think we tend to see look at a lot of what's happening in the West, but we also look at China with Western eyes without acknowledging sufficiently that the Chinese have a view of their own manifest destiny. If the US as a country of 200 years old has an idea of manifest destiny, China as a civilization of 5,000 years suffering the so-called century of humiliation have clearly decided they're no longer going to follow the Deng Xiaoping dictum, which is to bide your time and cool it. They've decided that now is the opportunity that they have to take. And as a Chinese word for crisis says, a crisis is both an opportunity and danger. And I think the Chinese leadership, not just Xi Jinping himself, but the entire Chinese leadership recognize that over the next 20 years, they have to truly assert themselves in the world. That's a very uncertain world, particularly for us in Southeast Asia, because we've been seen by the Chinese traditionally as within their sphere of influence, and the Americans don't necessarily see it that way. So I think it's a very uncertain period, and for countries in Southeast Asia having to deal with a Pax Sinica rather than the Pax Americana and the nuclear umbrella we've had for all these years is a very uncertain future for everyone.
Is that a less safe, less secure world then?
As I said, because the transition is happening now, I think I would be hazarding a guess if I was saying that it's going to be more safe, to the extent that the more uncertain a period is, the more unsafe it is, then I would say we're clearly less safe than before. But I'm not trying to imply that a Pax Americana and the comfort of having sort of an American world order is less safe than having a Chinese-dominated world order. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying we are seeing civilizational changes, and it's not. And I use the word civilizational as a different one than geopolitical. It's not just between superpowers. It's between a Western concept of democratic liberalism and the Chinese concept, and largely an East Asian concept. Now, of course, within that civilizational relationship, there's going to be a lot of other friction areas too, between Japan and China, between Korea and the rest of East Asia. So it's not a simplistic situation, but I think we are seeing some fundamental changes taking place now.
Thank you. Let me ask Nakayama-san then. Yes. What do you think? Are we in Asia right now in a more stable, less safe place than we were 10 years ago?
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And I always attend this meeting. There is using Japanese camera, and the cameraman from Japan, Mr. Kotaro Tamura, who is a Milken Institute fellow. And thank you, Dr. Kotaro. And I still feel threat and fear from North Korea. They have, what is called CVID, but they don't. I went to IAEA in Europe end of July, and we talked with Dr. Amano, but he collecting all the intelligence from all over the world, and the satellite never lied. We can see what's going on in their soil. And so they are still creating the atomic bombs, and especially the biochemical weapons, very deeply related to the Middle East situation. Like in Syria, they're using biochemical weapons to the people of Syria, but that chemical weapons cooperated by the North Korea. And also the Iranians has a lot of missiles. Those missiles, the techniques created by the North Korea. So we still carefully and focusing on the North Koreans' activities. And the human rights issue, they adapt our people from Japan, and they kidnapped, they captured them, and they're never still released. And also in China, Chinese government captured a few Japanese people. And I went to last December, and we talked with the foreign minister, and I personally request to release those Japanese kind of like hostages. And so surface looks like a little bit safer, But how about the South China Sea? When you think about the China, there is a keyword, is AI. AI means artificial intelligence, like I have in my head. The other one is artificial island. So they still have they are creating the artificial island in the South China Sea, and even this country and all the 10 ASEAN countries worried about those issues. Why? Because it's going to be effect to the East China Sea also. So the rule of the law, the human rights, the biochemical or dirty bombs, those kind of stuff and the ninja activities, all the spy communications still exist. And there is a traditional field like air, sea, water, and ground, but also the cyberspace. And now it's going to be a space, outer space. And if you have free apps in your smartphones, or maybe those apps, the game apps made by North Korea, and they have a malware inside. And if there is intelligence people, you know all about those things. So think not just the surface, but inside more carefully. And last thing I'd like to say is we are the Far East is still Cold War exists, not like a Cuba. We still have a Berlin Wall in 38-degree line. So if you're focusing on Korea Peninsula and Northeast Asia, you have to wear the glasses of the 20th century. And this time, Mr. Putin called all the delegates like a six-party talks look like. But it's really similar for me. It looks like a Yalta Treaty held out 73 years ago in Crimea. So this is going to be, and like President Trump and Kim Jong-un met at here, it's just the beginning for the 21st of Yalta Conference in Asia. So I hope those big guys talk not for their own profit, but share the profit for all. It's going to be needed for us, for the next generation, for the kids. Thank you.
Thank you. So some very key points you raised there. Bob, do you agree? I mean, do you think we're in as uncertain and as unsafe a world that the two gentlemen next to you have painted?
No, I don't. I actually think that Asia is significantly safer and more stable and less war-prone than it was a decade ago. We're thinking sort of decade, these are sort of medium-term trends, so let me just suggest 4 that I think make Asia less prone to stumble into some kind of serious conflict. The first is Asia is aging. Aging is bad for labor markets, but it's good for peace. Aging states don't fight. Aging states have, no, they don't. Aging states have severe internal distribution issues, intergenerational issues, right? Those things put pressure on defense budgets. That's good news. China will be the first country to age before it gets wealthy. That will put pressure on China's ability to militarily expand, which is some concern people have in the South China Sea. Second, Asia continues to trade and get wealthy. There's a lot of theory out there in social science that correlates trade dependence, interdependence with peace, right? I mean, this is disputed somewhat, but the fact that Asia is getting wealthier and wealthier means that the costs of conflict go up. Middle-class populations should be more risk-averse and less willing to take those kinds of risks, right? If you look at the literature in political science and international relations the last 10 or 15 years, there's a lot of sort of focus on the United States and China going to war, right? You know, Graham Allison wrote that book, The Thucydides Trap, last year. It's all over the media. But, you know, if you flip that image and you actually look at the last time there was a major land conflict in Asia, it was in 1979, right? I mean, there's a whole literature out that says actually that Asia is actually quite peaceful, right? That we have all these sort of factors out there that people think will lead to conflict. We keep saying this, right? Oh, we're going to have a war over Taiwan, the South China Sea, and North Korea, and then the Himalayas between India and China. And actually that hasn't happened, right? So there is actually an Asian peace is actually reasonably durable, I would argue. Next, back in the 2000s, so we're thinking like the 10-year time frame. You know, back in the years after 9/11 and the Iraq War, right? I mean, the big debate was about things like American empire, right? And American expansion and unilateral aggression, right? The United States was going to be out there in the world and dramatically remake the world order, right? America was a rogue superpower. That's over. The United States is now, I mean, under Donald Trump, I mean, it's hard to know, but the United States has sort of reverted to basically being the status quo power that it's been for a long time. So the American challenge to the international order from 10 years ago has more or less faded, right? It basically died in the sands of Iraq, right? So if you're an Asian, that's good, because that means the Americans aren't here anymore saying, we're going to flood your region with aircraft carriers, we're going to hunt down Muslims in all of your countries and pursue, all that is over, or it's fading away, right? We don't nearly talk about ISIS in Indonesia, for example, the way people did, or, bin Ladenists in Indonesia the way we did 10 years ago. That's all thankfully fading, right? So American pressure on regional systems has faded. And then finally, China. China's behavior gets a lot of focus in the maritime tier, right? Sort of Taiwan, South China Sea and stuff like that. But actually a maritime conflict in East Asia will be substantially less violent and less awful than a land conflict, right? And China has gone out of its way to more or less stabilize its land borders. That's good, right? A land conflict would be much, much worse than a few ships firing long distance missiles at one another, right? Or a few aircraft carriers or something like that. That's several thousand casualties. That's much, much worse than a major ground conflict between China and any of its neighbors, right? We worry a lot about sort of the rise of Chinese hegemony, emerging Chinese preponderance in the region. People say, oh, China's like, Wilhelmine Germany in World War I, we're going to have this major conflict. Well, World War I was a ground conflict in which millions of people died. If we have a maritime conflict because of Chinese expansion, it will be bad, but it won't be nearly as awful as if Russia and China or India and China or Vietnam and China went to war. So I would say yes, broadly speaking, if you look at the medium-term trends, yeah, Asia's much better than it was 10 years ago.
I see Kwon Ping shaking his head, but
no, I don't agree. Unfortunately.
Before we get to that, can I get to one point that I think you do all three agree upon, which is the leadership void in the region as the U.S. turns inwards? Right? I think the three of us or the three of you seem to agree on that point, that the U.S. is not as present here in this region as it used to be, and that has led to uncertainties, confusion, and changing dynamics. So if you can use that as a jump.
I guess what I would say is that if your main point was that if the world is safer than the other, and your definition of safer is, are we likely to see a world going to war tomorrow within the same, as likely as 10 years ago? I would say, sure, of course. But that to me is a false dichotomy. 10 years ago, I don't think the world was going to go to war, and I don't think tomorrow the world is going to go to war. But to the extent that, as you've just yourself pointed out, any leadership void globally causes uncertainty. That's one reason to feel less safe. The mere fact that the world is not likely to go to war tomorrow, and I would agree on that, doesn't mean the world is any safer. So to me, the world is less safe, but I'm not saying I think the world is going to go to war tomorrow. But we've got a huge leadership void by the US, which we all acknowledge. We've got a situation that many commentators have said in Europe and in America is very similar to the 1930s, with the rise of a plutocratic, populist, hard far right, with the liberal democracies like as happened in the 1930s, unable to resolve the issues of the inequities of globalization, unable to come up with any kind of reasonable alternative to massive immigration that's causing huge dislocations and causing very ordinary people in the West who would normally have supported liberal democracies to be now voting far right. So you've got a huge political uncertainty in Western Europe. You've got a whole world that is facing a leadership void, and you've got a China that is basically saying, it's my time on the world stage. China is clearly saying that. If the US were to just roll over and say, fine, we're just going to let you have it, that's fine and good. But you have some people recognizing that a Pax Americana is no longer there. Many people, including Donald Trump, as you just said, we don't really know what he thinks, but many people would not agree that a Pax Americana is over. And you've got the potential for a containment of China that occurred pre-World War II with Japan. And China is clearly recognizing this by launching its own BRI. And the BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative, is China's attempt to ensure that with its huge economy, it will have an independent supply chain to the rest of the world. And you see this being stymied also by others. So I clearly don't see how the world is safer today by simply arguing that, well, people are older. I would argue that older people are more willing, because they don't have to go to fight the war themselves, older people are more willing to be super virile, having forgotten what it was like to be young, and say, let's go to war. So I don't buy this, that simply because the world is aging, we should be more sanguine. I just can't buy that.
Let me pose a question to Nakayama-san here, because you talked about how Japan as a nation feels insecure with North Korea. We've heard about a more assertive China and what that means for the region. What, specifically in relation to China, what would it take for Japan to feel more secure in its relationship with China and how China behaves in the region?
Okay. So if I face to the Chinese government people, I shake hands. And I eat their providing food, I eat Chinese food. And if they come to Japan, I offer Japanese food and they will drink sake. So politically, if it's a good environment, we always shake hands. But on the other hand, of course, we have a territorial kind of like maritime issues, and also the technology changed the game of the war. So, for example, like cyber attacks, we get lots of cyber attacks, 40 seconds in every single minute towards Kasumigaseki, which is the Japanese bureaucrats building, and also the DOD of Japan. So who attack those facilities? So the game has been changed, not the old age people's talk. The new future technology makes not just a geopolitical, but the ideology of the war game. So we have to think how to hit the risk of the war during those changing the situation. And so this year is the 40th anniversary of official diplomatic relations between China. So we try to negotiate in a good mood. And also, on the other hand, from the military point of view, United States are going to reduce the armed forces in Okinawa, especially for the US Marine Corps, for 50%. And they move to Guam. And we are going to pay the budget for the move and also to create the new facility on the base of Guam in Tinian. And what does it mean? It's geopolitically, from the Chinese PLA's point of view, the US military going backwards from the Chinese soil. But from the US point of view, if you exist in Okinawa, very easy to shoot the missile because it's closer. So all the armament technology increasing, so there is no more reason to stay in Okinawa. So now we are investing lots of hotels, businesses in Okinawa, and United States camp and base will going back to our hand. But once something bad influence, but some kind of small conflict, if it's going to bigger and bigger and bigger, who is going to stop those military power? This is our concern and our purpose for amending the Constitution and to increasing our defense budget. And Japan had 2 atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki 73 years ago. And the Japan, have to lead those policy for non-proliferation issue, and also to avoid all the nuclear weapons from the Korea Peninsula. So why we exist in this particular area is, I think it's going to be a big reason. And one day, I hope, I wish I could create and establish Pacific Asia-Pacific headquarters of United Nations in Hiroshima one day. So every people who would like to talk about world peace, maybe gathering in Geneva, someone maybe in the African Union in Ethiopia, how about New York? But how about in Asian people gather in Hiroshima or Nagasaki? It's very fit, and it's very convenient to talk about those military issues. And if something, the big powers, like you told, the pancake US, China, I don't know which is going to be a power. But we can trust the United States. But China, sometimes trade. Russia, I think a little more. So I hope US-Japan alliance more strong and strength together for the future. And I hope the US never leave, US military power or intelligence power, never leave from this Northeast Asia region. We need US intelligence power. We need US military power, whoever the president is.
Bob, what do you think the Chinese have to do? I mean, we've heard, about the issues of trust with China and its intentions in the region. What do you think China has to do to reassure this region that its rise is peaceful,
Right.
and that its assertiveness, again, is non-threatening, intentionally?
Yeah. Well, settling border disputes, which is something I mentioned before, is an important one, right? Trying to show flexibility on that.
Do you think they will?
I do. Well, on the land tier, yeah, on the land perimeter, yeah, I think the Chinese have actually sort of, I mean, it's not great, but I think they made an effort, right? You certainly don't have, there's nothing outstanding like in the sense of like Alsace-Lorraine in 1914, right? On the sea there is somewhat, but so resolving territorial disputes, that's the first thing, right? And that's going to get thornier in the South China Sea. Some kind of rule set in the maritime tier, Senkaku, East China Sea, South China Sea, there's got to be some kind of rule set. If it's just Chinese exertion, eventually there's going to be pushback. I mean, I go to lots of conferences like this, and I'm already starting to hear people talking about American forces being landed on islands in the southern South China Sea in order to draw a red line or something like that, right? I mean, at some point we have to know what are the Chinese trying to do in South China Sea. I mean, are they going for the whole show or not? I mean, they want the entire dragon's tongue or not. If they do, they're going to provoke a balancing coalition. It would be also nice if we knew what the new Chinese leadership formula is, right? So I guess now we're out with the 10-year oligarchy system, right? And now we're going back towards autocracy or something or other. We don't really know, right? You mentioned uncertainty a lot. I mean, that's generated a great deal of uncertainty, right? Again, all you have to do is open foreign affairs and people are calling, Xi Jinping Mao and emperor and stuff like that. I mean, that generates enormous uncertainty as well.
Kwon Ping wants to jump in. Do you want to?
Can I just jump in?
Yes.
Because I think there's a Western view about Xi Jinping coming to power, this autocratic guy who's going to be a despot forever and so on, and that generates greater uncertainty. From the Chinese point of view, Xi Jinping is not just a crazy guy who's going to become another Mao Zedong. I think the Chinese point of view is that because China is going to be undergoing a global rise to power and all the steps are in place, they have a clear strategy, they need to have stability and continuity within their own domestic political system. So for many people from China who are not necessarily even particularly pro-communist, but who are essentially just impartial observers of the political scene, they see that the removal of the term limit for Xi Jinping was not so much this focus on him as an individual becoming a dictator, but that the Chinese leadership wants to ensure there's going to be a 10, 15-year continuity for China's rise to power. But when you mentioned earlier about uncertainty, I would certainly agree that right now, if you look at it sort of globally, China's trust sort of credit in the world, on the world stage has certainly increased in some areas, but not in other areas. Certain areas like in climate change, like in financial services, like in global infrastructure and so on, China has shown that it can be a player on the global stage and following the rules like everybody else. In certain other areas, they have not yet demonstrated it. But I think the South China Sea could be a good example of what China could do. You've seen that China has clearly said that unilaterally it will decide what are the boundaries. It doesn't recognize international law. They went in there, they unilaterally went in and built up all these islands with air bases, and they clearly want the US to be out. And their argument is that if the US is going to be patrolling in the South China Sea so near to China, then Chinese warships should just as well be patrolling off the coast of Chile, Peru, and in the Gulf of Mexico, because they clearly see Asia as their sphere of influence. I think the test of the pudding will be when China then started discussions with ASEAN countries on a code of conduct for the South China Sea, clearly leaving the US out because their claim is we are the guys who are the dominant player here. We will, together with ASEAN, set the rules. The test of this will be after a code of conduct is established for the South China Sea, with China leading it and with ASEAN sort of abiding by it and signing on to it, will the Chinese then follow it? I think to its great credit, the US clearly has been the global power around the world since World War II. The US basically set the rules, but it, by and large, some cases not always, but by and large, the US played by the rules that it set for the whole world. And by that, the US gained the trust of a lot of countries. China has to now show that if it's going to be a Pax Sinica and it's going to be the leading player in Asia, it has to also play by the rules. And I think one of the things you asked about whether, what can China do to assure its neighbors, China has to probably come out openly saying it will never invade Taiwan militarily. China has to settle with Japan somehow so that Japan doesn't feel the need of the US nuclear umbrella, which if I were Japanese today, I would certainly feel I need it, unless China assures me that it will not go to war with Japan for frivolous reasons. So China has a lot of trust building to do, but all I'm saying is that you see the cards changing now. You see Russia, China, Japan all having their own three-party discussions because they recognize that in the longer term, the US is clearly going to pull out of Asia. Whether you like it or not, you can encourage the Americans to stay in, but whether it's a Democratic administration or Republican administration, I think the cards are on the table. I mean, it's American presence in Asia is gradually declining, and the world has to come to recognize that.
Let me get back to you, Bob, to let you finish your thought on that if you wanted to, but also to add to you. What I'm also seeing, I mean, when I look at the foreign policy or the initiatives coming out of President Trump with the trade war and everything else, it seems to me that this sort of MAGA, Make America Great Again, stance that he has results in a world that doesn't necessarily find stability through cooperation, which is how it's been for the past 50 years, but rather stability through strength instead, or peace through strength instead of peace through cooperation. Is that the right reading of the situation?
Yeah, I mean, with Trump, it's just so hard to know because he just swings so wildly. My sense is right now is that the US bureaucracy, particularly in Asia, is basically trying to hold the American position in Asia together and wait to see if Trump is a real thing or a flash in the pan, right? We'll know better after the midterm election this fall and then the presidential election again in 2 years. If Trump represents a real radical shift in grand strategy, does it mean neo-isolationism or something like that? Does it mean retrenchment from Asia? I don't actually think that's correct myself. But we have to wait to see if Trump is not just a sort of strange quirk, an accidental president who sort of slipped through because of the quirk of the Electoral College. I mean, he did lose the popular vote by something like 3 million votes, right? And so it's not really clear to me yet that we should sort of go down that route. And I certainly don't see that in my operation. You know, I do a lot of consulting out here, and I go to U.S. bases and stuff. I don't actually see that. I actually see the American presence here expanding, certainly at least in Japan and Korea, right? I mean, we're building very, very large facilities here. And so I think right now what you're getting is this kind of strange disjuncture between PACOM, or now it's Indo-PACOM, right? And what you're getting from Washington, D.C., right? And Trump is kind of, he's facing a lot of bureaucratic resistance, right? I mean, he is. I mean, you know, Mattis and everybody else. I mean, if anybody went to Shangri-La Dialogue, I mean, Mattis was like the anti-Trump at that thing, right? I mean, people, they gave him like a 5-minute standing ovation, right? Trump barely got mentioned at that. It was almost as though Trump wasn't even there. It was sort of like autopilot. And that's, so you're getting this, you know, we also saw that in the Woodward book too, right? Where basically the president's advisors are preventing him from implementing a lot of what he thinks he wants to do, right? And at some point, right, well, in part because the president changes his mind all the time, right, so it's not even clear if he knows what he wants to do. But at some point, this weird impasse where the president is going one way and he's colliding with a bureaucracy that wants to stay on autopilot, at some point that's going to be resolved. And that's going to be resolved primarily at the ballot box, right? We need to know if Trump is the new normal or he's just some weird thing, this cul-de-sac that will resolve itself, and then we'll go back to something like the pivot to Asia. I agree that I don't think Trump wants that kind of stuff, but so far I don't actually see that he's really achieved that much. I don't actually see the United States retrenching from Asia. Not yet. I mean, it might happen if he survives, but I don't see it yet.
Nakayama-san, are we entering a world now where countries cooperate less with each other and that their basis of their relationship is based less on cooperation but more on strength instead? Is that the world that you see evolving here in Asia?
No, I don't think so.
Because you talk about defense spending and wanting to increase that in Japan. To me, that suggests improving your strength.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have to protect our own soil ourselves. That is the first issue. And we need a cooperation together with the friendship countries like US and also the Australia, also the South Korea. What I'd like to say is who controls the White House? Even the President Bush, Clinton, or the Trump son, whoever controls the White House, we trust United States citizens, American people. We trust free talk, free opinions exchange. You can express your feelings to the other, to the world, using the internet freely. This is a free country, democratic country. This is what I feel comfortable. If you go into China, if you publish Xi Jinping's some bad article in your book, which you published in Hong Kong.
Or you don't even have to do that. If you have a picture of Winnie the Pooh in China, you get censored. But
yeah, you can get arrested. You can get captured by the government. I cannot believe it. It's a free world. So who are you comfortable with? Even you doing some investment in economic field, even you active in the academic field, even you active in the politics, you want to control by someone or the government? I don't want it. I like to talk freely. I want to show my opinion 100% to the people, and we would like to exchange equal, where you are Muslim, Christian, Buddhism, Shrinist, free. So this is what we need. So about the nuclear umbrella issue too. I never feel threat if the US has nuclear weapons and they covered our area for protecting us. Even they attacked 2 bombs 73 years ago, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we now friend. We learn, and we have to create, we have to change the shape of the friendship during the bad days and in good days. And of course, for the Chinese also, we would like to China become more open, free country, protect rule of the law, and how do you say? My English skill is not so good. なんて知的財産 intellectual property issues. So those, the West. So still, Cold War exists in Asia. China and Russia still together. U.S., Japan, South Korea still together. And North Korea is now, wondering whether we should go with Trump or whether we should go with ex-KGB, Putin. So, very difficult question for the Kim Jong-un.
Speaking of which, let me go to Bob real quickly for that, because I know he's got some thoughts on Kim Jong-un. KGB, Putin or Trump? Who do you think Kim Jong-un is or even Xi Jinping? Who do you think Kim Jong-un is sitting in his office or his presidential chair, or chairman's chair, I should say, thinking about?
The Chinese. North Korea really can't do anything significant without at least China's willingness to look the other way, right? You don't necessarily have to have consent, but China at least has to not object. It's one of the reasons why the new leadership has emphasized the dual line of nuclear weapons development and economic development in order to relieve North Korea's dependence on Chinese imports, right? Nuclear weapons should ideally also allow the North Koreans to spend less in the military, thereby opening up even more resources for the economy. All of that reduction in the need for Chinese imports should give North Korea greater political room against the Chinese. I don't think the North Koreans really expect much from Donald Trump. Donald Trump is so erratic on North Korea, and it's just one thing or the other that I don't get that sense at all. No, I mean, North Korea has more or less been and working with China in one way or another, and sort of dependent on Chinese import toleration and sanctions violations and things like that. And North Korea's access to the global banking system goes through Chinese banks. So no, I think it's pretty much China.
Could I just build on that to the extent that I think while there's a lot of media attention on North Korea and the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit and so on, And a lot of the saber rattling about the nuclear threat from North Korea is actually of its own doing to attract attention. I think one far more fundamental issue that's still not resolved in this region is Japan-China relations. And if I were Japanese today, I would actually feel a lot more unsafe than 10 years ago. Because while we all would hope that America is not going to retrench from Asia rapidly, if it does so, it should do it as slowly as possibly. But we don't know. It's not only a matter of Trump. It could be this administration or future administrations. The one question that one does have to ask is, if you ask the American people as a whole today, are you willing to have your son die overseas? For Vietnam, they did. They weren't so happy. Iraq and Afghanistan, they did. Are they going to have American boys go and die trying to protect Japan? Clearly, I think the answer from any American politician today is, while they try to assuage Japan by saying there's a nuclear umbrella and so on, the Chinese are now quite questioning whether the will of America as a whole, in the whole period after World War II, whether America as a whole really is going to be willing to sacrifice a lot to protect Japan. Japan feels very unsafe for very good reasons. China has got a long history of animosity towards Japan, very deep-seated animosity. The whole issue of Japan-China relations has not been resolved. As you know, Japanese history books and Chinese history books are not like English history books and German history books, which now sing the same storyline about what happened in World War II. The Japanese version of what happened in World War II and the Chinese version are worlds apart. The young people of both countries have completely different worldviews, despite the superficialness of the internet culture and so on. So I think if you look at history, Japan-Chinese tensions have been at the root of a lot of problems going back from World War II. And it's a dilemma right now. Japan is now asking itself, should it rearm? Is America going to be dependable 50 years from now? And you do not rearm over 5 years. You take 20 years to rearm. So is Japan going to rearm if the American protection is going to be gone? Is China to be relied upon if you're not armed? At the same time, Japan does rearm for very valid defense reasons. China, with its long history of Japanese, I wouldn't want to say aggression, let's say Japanese intervention in China, the Chinese are going to react to that extremely negatively. So to me, Japanese-Chinese relations are bubbling there with a lot of superficial niceties, but it's far more fundamentally fraught with problems than the North Korean issue, which, as you've said, the Chinese are largely able to control, and they control it this way and that way for their own advantages.
Nakayama-san, do you think a rapprochement between China and Japan is viable, is possible?
You mean the...
Kwon Ping brought up some issues that you've also brought up as well, this uncertainty and this insecurity that Japan feels from China. And the question is, despite the fact that there may be a warming of relations on the surface, there are deep-seated issues that will take a very long time to work out. Are you at all optimistic that the deep-seated historical legacy between Japan and China can be overcome?
Geopolitically, if you look at the Pacific Ocean, Chinese PLA strategy is beyond the Japan, cross over the Japan. I think they are planning to control from the western part of Hawaii to Asia. And the US going to pull out till Hawaii to east. So I think China, the Chinese PLA, not so much tension towards Japanese self-defense forces, because they are not thinking about only Japan, but whole Asia and the western part of Pacific Ocean. So, for example, Chinese PLA creating the new submarines since 1991. 1991, the Chinese PLA has not so much nuclear submarines, but now they creating more than 52 submarines. And also JL-2 missiles it range about 7,000 or 8,000 kilo. So if go from Qingdao towards the South China Sea or East China Sea, they can launch to the mainland of the United States. So this is what we have a concern, not just the China and Japan relationship. We, the Japan, if we are going to rearm, we are going to protect our allies, not just ourselves. I'm a politician. I ran for the election when I was 25. Now I am 48 next month. And I'm a fifth term. I'm a chairman of the Japanese House of Representatives. I know the real politics. I've been to North Korea. I talked with Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping only shake hands, but
he got the photo up. He got the photo up. That's good.
But how do you say? I can see their strategy using military issues, using political field, using cyberspace, and space fight against Trump, and even including Russia's, and using the North Korea situation of the World War II stories, Yalta Conference stories. So all the standards has been changed. So we have to prepare for the regularly. But for the irregular situation, we have to prepare for the irregular ideas. So that's what I'm thinking in real politics.
Okay. Let me just pivot a little bit. We've been talking a lot about military issues. Let me talk about economic issues, because we understand nowadays that the economy is also of strategic importance to a country's stability as well. When you look at the trade war that's happening right now between the US and China, and why don't I point this question at you then, Bob?
Sure.
Is this the beginning of a longer-term conflict between two interdependent economies, competitors, right, potential allies, potential rivals?
Sure. Again, because of the variability and the unpredictability introduced by the particular character of the American president, it's really hard to answer that question. I mean, that's really the problem here, right?
Yeah,
no,
yes,
really.
but,
I mean,
his
this is why we need to...
Peter Navarro wrote a book calling it, I think it was called Death by China.
Yeah.
So his advisors, he has advisors around him who have talked about how the U.S. has been taken advantage of by China. I mean, he may have been, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's all right. No, so I mean, but that just sort of muddies the waters again and again and again, because it's not even quite clear to me that the president understands what the end state, the desired end state of the trade war is. It's not clear to me that the Chinese actually know what they need to do in order to satisfy Donald Trump. If you look at Donald Trump attacking Canada and stuff like that in Mexico, I mean, a lot of this is driven by sort of the president's very unique psychology and his manipulation of Twitter and things like that. And that really blurs the water. That really sort of blurs the issue far too much. There is though a growing strategic issue, right? That the engagement of China in the 1990s, PFMN, getting China into WTO, right? In order to encourage Chinese economic liberalization, which would then encourage Chinese political liberalization. That project, some would say, Steve Bannon is probably the most famous proponent of this, although his reputation is now sort of as white nationalism and everything else. But Bannon actually talked about this a lot. And you hear this sort of bubbling up in the strategic literature, that this has failed, right? That we were hoping that engaging China, getting China's GDP per capita up would encourage liberalization. We're thinking Taiwan, South Korea, places like that. And it hasn't really worked, right? Instead, now we've got the swing towards autocracy or whatever it is we're getting from Xi, right? And that therefore, economic engagement to encourage better Chinese behavior is now, we should stop doing it, right? And we should actually start pursuing some kind of hostile or competitive or strategic trade relationship with China, because we just don't think this is going to work anymore. What that basically is saying is that trade is actually not really the point here. Trade is supposed to be a tool to encourage better Chinese behavior, liberalization, right? The Clinton administration famously said this, right? That trade with China was modernization by stealth. And there is this argument out there increasingly from neocons and I think the US military and others, and Bannon, right, and others, that this has failed. I don't know if that is what the president is trying to do. Right? If you actually read the president's national security statement from January, it doesn't say any of these kinds of things, right? It's fairly traditional, sort of like America should be out in the world, America's forward presence, right? It's not a Trumpist document. The closest thing we'd have a programmatic statement of foreign policy from this government is the national security statement from January, February, and it doesn't say this kind of stuff at all. So it's not clear to me if the president actually stands behind this or wants it. I mean, Bannon does, and a few, like you meet guys from like the Heritage Foundation and stuff like that who'll say this, but is that the White House? I just don't know. Again, that's why I keep saying when it comes to passing judgment on this president, we need to wait to see if the erratic, unpredictable, highly variable character of this president gets ratified at the ballot box. I want to wait before I say that we're into some lasting new normal of trade war and retrenchment and everything else, because this president is just he's such an outlier. He's such an outlier.
Yep.
I think the Chinese worldview is somewhat different, maybe because they don't see the world in electoral cycles, but they see it much longer term. I think the Chinese actually think that Donald Trump is a bit of a sideshow. I think they've looked beyond Donald Trump, and what they've recognized that the things that could happen, a trade war with massive tariffs against China for whatever reasons, and other things that could happen. I think the Chinese are, and this is the dangerous part that I see happening, rightly or wrongly, again, I say rightly or wrongly, I think the Chinese worldview is that their own manifest destiny is beginning to materialize. And they are going to get what they think is their rightful place under the sun. And that there are attempts to block it. Whether they'll be short-lived or not because of Donald Trump or not, my own view is that the Chinese have said, Donald Trump or no Donald Trump, the fact that an American president could do this means another American president could do it in the future. So they've seen the writing on the wall, and they're taking steps to ensure that their rise to power cannot be blocked. And therein lies the danger. On one hand, you've got a huge civilization with its legitimate right to ascend to its rightful place under the sun. At the same time, a power that is highly resentful and possibly very reactive in an uncertain way also. If Donald Trump is uncertain, one cannot say that the power elements within China, and certainly there must be many different factions, some more right-wing, some more dovish, you cannot say that China is going to react to everything in a very rational manner either. And that's, I think, the danger of the trade war, is that you've seen China actually looking at the trade war, essentially saying now we're going to retaliate tit for tat no matter how it hurts us. And at the same time, this is a wake-up call for us, China, to clearly develop its own domestic economy and its domestic market. We cannot rely on exports to the US. So if nothing else, the trade war, or the possibility of a trade war, to the Chinese, it's a wake-up call. And many of these things that are happening to the Chinese are wake-up calls, and I wouldn't want to wake up one day with these wake-up calls and find that we are in a far more dangerous situation than we are even today.
Nakayama-san, do you think the trade war between the US and China is just a solo economic issue, or do you see that as part of a wider range of fronts that the US is employing with China?
As you're told, I think it's just a tool. And there is a cold war. I mean, the war, the word is war, but there is some few types of war: economic war, trading war, rule war, everything. So I think President Trump, using those manipulation technology from him toward the Chinese and the world, and using all the media reflection to focusing on the issues, of course, before the election in November. But one thing I'd like to say, even President Trump, I mean, he is the first time in history he talked directly in bilateral with North Korean leader after the World War II. This is, actually it's good, because what is a North Korean issue? It's geopolitically, who is going to grab those areas, rather US or the China? I think the North Korea, if they are going to open the door to the world, hope they become not like a communist country, but more like a free world. I mean, the Western country, if the Cold War, the US is going to be getting into the North Korea. It's more like we can get more information. So, and also the democratic country responsibility is who going to choose your president or prime minister. Sometimes people criticize the President Trump, but it's who vote for President Trump. I never vote him, but the U.S. citizens vote, and the result is a Trump president, right? We now are doing the election in Tokyo, Liberal Democratic Party's leader's election. So now Mr. Abe is not the leader of the Japan's LDP party, Liberal Democratic Party. Now he is in a race during the campaign in Tokyo, actually. So it's going to be 20th. I'm going to vote for Abe, and I'm so sure that he will win the game of the election. But
okay.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I had originally wanted to open it up for questions, but I don't think we're going to have time for that, so I apologize. So I'm going to leave our panelists with this little final question. If you had 2 minutes in the room with a world leader, what is the one question you'd want to ask, and what's the one piece of advice you would give them? And why don't I start with Bob for that? So you get to pick your leader.
Like anyone in the world or Asia, since this is
Asia related, topically related, but if it's someone in Europe and you want to ask them a question about Asia, that's fine too. But basically, what's one question you'd like to ask them, and one piece of advice you would give?
I guess it would have to be Xi Jinping. I want to say Kim Jong-un because the North Korean nuclear issue is so big, but I guess it would have to be Xi Jinping. And the question I would ask is, what are the projected limits of Chinese expansion in the East and South China Seas? Right? Where is this going? Right? Are you looking for a fight? Right? I mean, because there is this argument, right, that sort of by overthrowing the system, he needs to sort of like find some kind of new justification. You know, naval nationalism is the term thrown around sometimes. I mean, is he sort of like purposefully doing this to kind of like gin up a kind of rally around the flag effect? Because I mean, if there's the most likely flashpoint for a serious conflict in Asia, and the one that we really care about is Sino-US. Sino-Japan is bad, but Sino-US is worse, right? Is the South China Sea and the East China Sea, right? And we need rules. So what do you want, and can we come to a compromise?
Okay, and then what's your piece of advice?
I'll pass on that. I'm not sure if I have a piece of advice.
Okay. Why don't we go with Kwon Ping at the end?
I suppose I wouldn't be looking at geopolitical situations, because I think individual leaders are less influential on that. It's pretty much the security establishments of both countries that would be determining that. If I were to ask any leader in Asia, I think I would be most depressed by the fact of the lack of good governance and the lack of accountability.
So is there a country here that you're referring to?
I would probably ask all the ASEAN leaders.
All the ASEAN leaders, okay.
I would ask the ASEAN leaders very simply, are you listening to your people? And the advice would be the question, that would be the question. The advice would be, listen to your people. And then you may not have a Malaysian situation happening to you. I think the ASEAN, this is a completely different subject, but I think the problem I see as a member of ASEAN is that our political leadership within ASEAN, leaving aside Singapore, of course, I don't think there's a lot of accountability. I don't think there's a lot of good governance. I don't think they're listening to their people, and they should just listen to their people more.
Okay. And finally, Nakayama-san, if you had 2 minutes in the room with a world leader, who would it be? What's your question? And what advice would you give them? You've got about a minute to answer.
Okay, I'm going to ask the P5 countries in the United Nations to request, we would like to invite the United Nations headquarters of Asia Pacific in Hiroshima.
So number one, would you set up your headquarters here in Japan in Hiroshima?
Yes.
One advice you would give them, one piece of advice.
Set it up.
Vote for Japan.
Vote for Japan. There we go. Okay. All right. Okay. You got some advice?
I had my piece. I thought about that. If you're China, you don't have to fight, right? Trends are running in your direction, right? The United States, in the last 15 years, the United States has had the Iraq War, the Great Recession, and the election of Donald Trump. The Americans are shooting themselves in the foot again and again and again, right? We're undercutting American hegemony, right? You know, China's growing, still growing at 3 times America's growth rate, right? By PPP, maybe China's bigger than the US, right? By MER, it'll probably be by 2030. We all know this, right? If you're China, you don't have to fight, right? It's not 1914 for you, where suddenly the Russians are building railroads, and if the Germans don't fight, they're going to be in Prussia the next day, right? You can just wait for the apple to fall into your lap. Right? You don't, no, really, if you're China, you don't, right, I say this to my students all the time, this is a really important conversation for the Japanese too, because the Japanese are basically watching China pull away, and they don't know what to do. And that's a really, really big problem. The most important medium-term decision that will take place in the next 10 years in Asia is the Japanese electorate's decision to either contest China and compete or roll over and accept Chinese preponderance in the region. Right? We haven't talked about that, but that's what I always argue. Anyway, the short version is that, and why? Because Japan is stagnating and China is just running away with the game because of it. India is a generation behind, which basically means that the Chinese just have to stand there and just wait for the apple to fall into their lap. So if you're China, you don't have to fight.
Okay.
You just grow.
So there we go. So
no, really, you just grow and build robots. Grow and build drones, and you win. Really, that's it. That's it.
So let me just recap.
And missiles.
So with that, we have listen to your people, you don't have to fight, and vote for Japan. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you all very much.